A way to get in early and often is teach, consult, subject matter expertise, be seen as a trusted advisor. So this is how a data center operator and telecommunications provider should be finding their target audience. This is how they should be generating leads with their target audience. This is how they should be nurturing their target audience, all the way to the point of deals, closed won deals, onboarded new clients, delighted new clients. Your account managers, your client success should even be part of this whole process. It has a game-changing impact when your prospects, when your clients, when your channel partners see your client-facing team members as experts. This changes the nature of who you should be hiring. Hey, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscalers, colocation providers, edge, modular data center providers, wholesale data center providers, as well as the dozens of different kinds of technology and facilities related companies in and around data centers, digital infrastructure and critical facilities, plus construction, real estate and investment companies, as well as all of the different kinds of outsourced sales and marketing companies that work within data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. Regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market team, perhaps you work in sales, such as an account executive, an AE, or an SDR, or a BDR, a sales development rep, or a business development rep, or maybe you work post-purchase in some kind of role similar to like an account manager, or a client success, customer success, or perhaps you work in product management or channel partnerships, or maybe you're the executive sponsor, the leader who's responsible for recruiting all of the right people into the right roles, having people in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their instruments at the right tempo, in sync with each other at the right volume to make all these terrific things happen within the period of amazing growth right now within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. If you want to stay in the loop on upcoming educational resources and educational events just like this, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. That way you'll get notified each Sunday directly to your email inbox. So what is on the agenda for this week's show? First up, we're going to talk about how a data center operator and telecommunications provider finds their target audience. After that, we'll look at how a data center design and construction marketer can get an audience for their content and events. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a data center telecommunications provider motivates potential customers. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how an energy efficient data center solutions provider can generate awareness, how a cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity company generates new leads. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how an oil and gas technology and services company grows its data center revenue. If you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, or a question that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll be sure to add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming show. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question, which is, how does a data center operator and telecommunications provider find their target audience? How does a company that's principally in the business of being a data center operator and a telecommunications provider find their target audience? So the first question we need to figure out is how big or small your company is and how big or small your target clients are. At the end of the essence of this is we need to figure out, are you able to sell data center space, like colocation space, as well as telecommunications services to the exact same clients, or are they really two different kinds of client bases? It's a much simpler go-to-market, much simpler sales and marketing challenge if it's the exact same client base that we're selling space to, as well as power and cooling and telecommunications. For the sake of simplicity in this example, we're going to go with the idea that you've put together a pretty homogeneous client base. All your clients are relatively similar, and they love the idea of being able to get colocation and telecommunications from the same company, from your company. Now, the question is, in addition to your own telecommunication circuits, being your own carrier, are you also going to be carrier neutral? Are you also going to allow all of the different diversity into your peering and your meet me rooms and your IXs and everything to give clients what they ultimately crave, which is many times competition and choice for redundancy for solving their actual business needs and edge needs and latency needs, compliance needs, governance needs. But so same client base is buying from you as both a data center operator as well as a telecommunications carrier. How are we going to find your target audience? Well, we need to know where you've been most successful in the past. In other words, when we look at your case studies, when we look at your testimonials and reviews, when we look at your logos, when you pull up your CRM, your customer relationship management system, when we talk to your finance executive, like, what do they tell us about where you've been most successful? What kinds of clients spend the most, are the most profitable, have the best unit economics, have the highest happiness score, the highest net promoter score, are the most likely to expand their relationships over time? All of those factors come into play with figuring out who that ideal client is. And when you have strong consensus on that, you should be able to document your ideal client profile, your ICP. So you know geographically where they're located, how big or small their companies are there certain industries that you tend to do better at than others? Because, of course, depending on where you're located and the kinds of industries you target, there may be certain compliance requirements, some certification requirements that you need to have to operate a colocation business, perhaps even a telecommunications business, depending on the nature of these kinds of clients and what you're actually doing for them, that intersect with both a geographic location and industry. So in other words, like, where do you have a unfair advantage to win with certain sectors, with certain kind of niches? And where are you going to get knocked out almost instantly because those kinds of businesses are going to ask for something that you just can't deliver right now? So that's your ideal client profile. What's interesting too is when it comes to both telecommunications, when it comes to being a data center operator, and by data center operator, I'm going with the idea here that the most common kind of data center operator is the colocation operator, but perhaps you're winning based on precise location, maybe smaller footprint in an edge context. Maybe you're winning based on a huge kind of single anchor tenants and like a hyperscale or a wholesale data center kind of context. But we know the most common type of data center operator that you're likely to see in the field with this kind of challenge would be a colocation operator. We have dozens, maybe hundreds of different tenants in your facility. And in this context, your company also provides telecommunication services as opposed to just bringing circuits and carriers in from other companies. So to find your target audience, we've narrowed down the ideal client profile. It's highly likely as a data center operator that your target audience could be both hyper local and could be long distance. In other words, there's a certain kind of client, especially SMB, but sometimes mid-market enterprise as well, that heavily biases towards proximity. In other words, they love the idea that they can get in the car, perhaps even walk to your facility, whether that's from their office, their home, or a little bit of both. I was chatting online with a CEO of a colocation operator a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about one of their peers, 2-mile radius. Like, the CTOs want the colocation facility to be within 2 miles of their location. I don't know whether it was their home location, whether it was their office location or a branch location, but yeah, really, really close proximity. So that's your hyper local playbook. And in that context, you'll do a lot of community building events, one being hopefully in an editorial presence, sometimes in a sponsor presence, in most of the events that your ideal buyer persona, that your ideal clients, that your target buyer personas are attending on a regular basis. In addition to that, it's usually wildly successful for you to host your own events in your own facility. So that's where, if you have a classroom or a conference room or a foyer or something like that, where you can invite a dozen, 2 dozen, whatever it is, of your ideal prospects, of your ideal future clients into your facility once a month, maybe twice a month, maybe it's once a month for a certain kind of segment, and then that's the first week of the month, and then the third week of the month your secondary buyer persona. So 12 times a year you're getting to each of your 2 most important segments, and you're just inviting them in to teach them some cool stuff to help them do their job better. In other words, once you understand who the primary and secondary most important stakeholders are in your target audience, your primary and secondary buyer persona, maybe one is the CTO of a mid-market financial services company, and the other one is the owner of a IT services firm that happens to also be a managed service provider, like a channel partner play, and you understand their goals and challenges. Maybe there's 5 or 10 goals or challenges that keep coming up over and over again when you do this research. Take those 5 or 10 goals and challenges, and those are 5 or 10 separate events that you should host over the next 5 or 10 months. And don't try to be lazy and commingle both audiences together. If you really want to pop with relevancy, keep the CTOs of the financial services company separate from the channel partners, because they care about different issues. So you invite 50, 100, 200 people, whatever it is in your local area, knowing that maybe a quarter of them say yes, and it's a free event. So half of those quarter will actually show up. So you get your 10 or 20 people attending. They join you for a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn, whatever it is. You have them block out 75 or 90 minutes. They arrive, they check in, a little bit of chatting, networking time, having some lunch or breakfast. Your subject matter expert, either your internal subject matter expert or external subject matter expert, presents the main focus of the program for 30 or 45 minutes. The content should be just as good as if they flew to the other side of the country or the other side of the world to attend that session at a major conference. So they talk for 30 or 40 minutes. They answer questions for 10 or 20 minutes. And then you say, come on, let's go take a tour. And you take people around a tour and your facility, and hopefully you made a good first impression with those folks, that they learned from your subject matter expert. They enjoyed visiting your facility. They learned some unique insights that can help them do their job better, to better achieve their goals, their team's goals, their company's goals, addressing some of the biggest challenges that they're facing when it comes to digital infrastructure and telecommunications. And when you do this on a regular basis, you will find your target audience. And most importantly, you'll get your target audience to be highly motivated to want to spend a lot of time with your client-facing team members. And that is incredibly important in today's self-driven buyer's journey, where most of your target audience, by default, is more sales allergic than ever. They just don't want to spend a lot of time with sales teams until they're just about ready to buy. However, they still need to learn. They still need learning and development. They still need professional development. So if you are able to position your invitations to be part of how they learn, to improve how they do their job, either because they work in IT or infrastructure for a financial services company or manufacturing company or healthcare company, or whatever it is, or they own a managed service provider business, or whatever it is. If you can dial into understanding what's going on in their world, what they're trying to achieve, what they're struggling with, and show up as a solution to that, invite 10, 20, 30 people together for these face-to-face events, fantastic. It motivates them to want to spend time with you. And the more time they spend with you, the more likely it is that they're starting to get introduced to your frameworks, your way of seeing the world, and you're able to significantly influence how they evaluate the other options that are in front of them. So much so that not only do you get onto the short list, in many cases, you will not only survive the short list all the way to the end when they're ready for sales contact, when they hit that 83% point in their journey where they're finally ready for a sales conversation, but in many cases, when you do this exceptionally well, you'll start to notice that the one person that registered starts to bring their coworkers along with them to these events. There's a lot of magic that happens when you see that, because you're starting to build alignment internally across the decision committee. You're starting to get introduced to who the decision committee is, information that often is very elusive if you're just poking around a tool like LinkedIn Sales Navigator. Having these educational events where you're educating and building trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so that they see you and your client-facing team members no longer just as a vendor that's focused on a transaction or getting them to sign up for a lease for your colocation space or a subscription agreement for your telecommunications. No, 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 no. They now see you as an expert, a subject matter expert, a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader. And when that happens, truly magic in your sales process, in your new client onboarding, in your initial value, intended value, extended value, your land and expand, growing those accounts, positive word of mouth referral, customer advocacy, all these wonderful things happen when you start out that relationship by getting in early and getting in often. Most of your competitors are completely asleep at the wheel when it comes to understanding just how much buyer behavior has changed in the last 5 or 10 years. 10 years ago, they used to talk with sales teams when they were halfway through the journey. Now they're almost ready to buy, 83% of the way through their journey, Gartner stats on when they're ready for sales contact, when they're ready for vendor contact. So if you are completely absent, guess who's going to stack the decks in their favor? Your direct competitors, your indirect competitors, maybe even non-business model competitors. It is incredibly important. This just isn't about differentiation. This just isn't about building a brand. This is about competitive survival and recognizing that this is the new battleground. The self-driven buyer's journey is a really, really big deal. The way to get in early and often is teach, consult, subject matter expertise, be seen as a trusted advisor. So this is how a data center operator and telecommunications provider should be finding their target audience. This is how they should be generating leads with their target audience. This is how they should be nurturing their target audience, all the way to the point of deals, closed won deals, onboarded new clients, delighted new clients. Your account managers, your client success should even be part of this whole process. It has a game-changing impact when your prospects, when your clients, when your channel partners see your client-facing team members as experts. This changes the nature of who you should be hiring. This changes the nature of upskilling, cross-skilling, retraining, and overall positioning. Does this mean you should immediately go into your email signature, LinkedIn profile, and business card and find a better synonym for the job title? That's certainly part of it. But for most companies that are data center operators and telecommunications providers, especially small to mid-sized ones that don't have huge brand footprint already in the marketplace, these kinds of changes are cultural changes within a company, and they need to start at the top. If your company has fewer than 500 employees, certainly fewer than 200 employees, your CEO needs to be all in on loving this idea. If he or she doesn't, you're going nowhere fast. You're going to be marketing like it's still 1999. Hey, someone want to send out a broadcast fax? What happened to MySpace? Maybe we should just collect some business cards in a fishbowl and see what happens when we send out a postcard to announce the results. Or better yet, we can put a display ad in the newspaper to advertise our breakfast seminar and see what happens. If we're living in the present and we truly understand our buyer personas and their preferences, it is incredibly important to show up in the way that our ideal clients, our target buyer personas want us to show up. Now, we've been talking primarily about the hyperlocal playbook. However, when it comes to being a data center operator and a telecommunications provider, you'll also have a fair amount of prospects and clients that are long distance, that can't walk or drive or get to your facility within 30 to 60 minutes. And those are a big opportunity too. And what you're going to want to do is when you get your customer insight research together, you get your buyer persona research together, and you figure out your 10 or 12 big goals and challenges for each of these segments that you want to address in your educational events over the next 10 or 12 months. Guess what you're going to do for the long distance folks? Well, of course, when you host these events in your classroom, your conference room, your training room, by all means, record those. And in addition to making those available on demand for all of the attendees, coworkers, and bosses and colleagues and silent decision makers who weren't able to attend, but still want to know what was talked about, you basically take the same content and the same subject matter experts, either the subject matter expert speakers that are internal from your company or external, and you run the same playbook as webinars and live streams to the target audience that can't get to your facility within a 30 or 60-minute drive. And again, do the same thing. An educational webinar, best case scenario, 25, 50% attendance rate. And with all the business travel that people undertake in and around digital infrastructure, it can be challenging to find a week when people aren't in conference overload mode. So super important to not only be cognizant of that when you're scheduling for your buyer personas, but also record everything. Because again, maybe you have 30 people, 50 people, 100 people, whatever it is, chances are there are 10x to 100x more that should have been there that just weren't there because of a scheduling conflict. When it comes to decision maker, there's no single decision maker anymore. Almost everything is a decision committee. It's incredibly important, if you can't get multiple members of the decision committee to attend live, that your internal champion, whoever is your initial foot in the door, has these recordings to be able to forward around to their colleagues. So that's the long distance version of running the same playbook. So if you're a data center operator that also has telecommunications carrier business interests, and you're offering both of these services to your clients, this is how you can go about finding your target audience, growing pipeline with this target audience, growing new clients, and growing new revenue with this target audience. So that's how a data center operator and telecommunications provider finds their target audience. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the love by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. So what do we have up next? What's our next question for this week? How does a data center design and construction marketer get an audience for their content and events? So your company provides data center design and construction, and you're working in a marketing role. And your marketing role is focused on getting in front of the right people, the right audience for your content creation and your events. And since you didn't mention specifically whether you're talking about in-person events or online events, we'll make the advice applicable to both. Because without both of those, your chances are you're missing a lot of potential audience. So your company is a design and construction company operating within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, is kind of the first cousin of like data center real estate and data center investors. Your end clients, your audience that you're typically trying to reach are data center developers, which might be considered like wholesale data center providers, or just data center operators in general. Maybe you're selling directly to colocation operators or hyperscale operators or edge data center builders, edge data center providers. You may also be selling to end users that have their own enterprise data centers, like a financial services company that instead of renting space in colocation facilities has built one or more of their own data centers in the geographic regions that are most important to their client base. So that's generally who you're selling design and construction to. Based on the nature of your business model, you may determine that your primary and secondary buyer personas could be like the principal of a small to mid-sized contractor company. It could be a construction manager. It could be a design manager. It could be a VP of development. The nature of how you segment your ideal client profile, the nature of how you identify your buyer personas is going to vary quite a bit depending on your company's size and how expansive or how narrow your menu of services is, as well as your target clients and their company size. Other things being equal, the smaller the company is that you're selling to, the less you need to be incredibly precise about identifying the perfect job function, the perfect buyer persona to educate and build trust with, just simply because everyone knows everyone else. Let's say you're selling your data center design to industrial designers or architecture firms that don't have a lot of expertise in industrial or data centers. Maybe you've identified that that's an important secondary buyer persona or tertiary buyer persona for you. And in that particular context, maybe you found over time that these firms tend to be relatively small, a couple dozen employees. In that particular case, you probably will still have an idea of who the partner isn't that firm that you want to get the ear of, that you want to get a foot in the door with. But the reality is, even if you get an intern or an associate or an administrator in that firm, everyone's going to know in a 30, 40, 50 person architecture firm that doesn't specialize in data centers, they're going to know the one or two people in the company who actually are interested in data centers. So you're not going to have to jump through crazy hoops to get from initial person to the perfect person. Larger companies is the opposite problem. In larger companies, like, yeah, you need to be a lot more granular about the job functions, the job roles, the locations, like who is working on what. And the same thing with construction. The bigger the company is, the more granular your persona, your segmentation strategy needs to be for content and events. And the smaller the company, the less it actually matters, because people tend to wear a lot of hats in smaller companies, and a lot of hard hats. If it's a really small company, maybe they're even sharing the same hard hat. That could get a little gross at times, I guess, but you get the basic idea here, is that the smaller companies, people tend to take on a lot of different roles that tend to be a lot more specialized in much larger companies. So for sure, it impacts how you define your audience, and it defines how you identify and prioritize your buyer personas, and ultimately what you're going to choose to do with content and events. So as long as your company is relatively established and you've figured out who these ideal clients are, you know where they tend to be located geographically, are you working within like one particular state or province? Can you provide design and construction throughout an entire country, multiple countries, an entire continent, globally? Again, only you can answer that question based on your current resources and capabilities. But within your ideal client profile, know geographically who's going to be consuming this content, who's going to be attending these events, where they're located. Second, how big or how small are their companies? As I was just alluding to a few moments ago, it makes a really, really big difference. You know what your minimum project size is, right? And presumably, if you've been doing this a while, you likely also have a pretty strong sense of who your largest clients are before there's a dramatic drop off where they're so big that your likelihood of winning that kind of business and retaining that kind of business is very, very slim. So for a small to mid-sized data center design and construction company, maybe you thrive selling to clients that have anywhere from, on the low end, maybe 50 employees, or maybe 200 employees, on the high end up to 5,000 employees or 10,000 employees. Maybe you found that if a data center operator or enterprise has more than 10,000 employees, they're just asking for all kinds of financial, legal, compliance, integration, whatever logistics kind of requirements that you just can't meet today, given your company's current size. So knowing the size band of how small or how big your ideal clients are is hugely, hugely helpful when it comes to getting to the right audience for your content and your events, especially when you start thinking about like outbound marketing, outbound prospecting, account-based marketing, running LinkedIn ads, anything where you have access to company size based on headcount, based on number of employees. And then there's certain industries where you may do better than others, but all of that will help you define that ideal client profile. From your ideal client profile, you should be able to back into creating a target account list of anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred. In some cases, it could be more than a few hundred perfect companies that you'd love to do business with for data center design and construction. And within those companies, now we have to figure out who are the first and second most, maybe third most important kind of stakeholder in each of those kinds of companies that we need to educate and build trust with. And this is where your content, this is where your educational resources, your educational events will need to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And it's more important than ever today, because we now live in a world where so many of your ideal prospects and clients are more sales allergic than ever. 10 years ago, people would get about halfway through their buying cycle and they'd be ready to meet with a business development manager or project manager or someone in a client-facing capability that worked on new business for your company. Now, pretty much across the entire data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities ecosystem, nearly all want this self-driven journey where they just do tons of research on their own before they're ready for a sales-related conversation. And that's difficult for a lot of companies that are still running a very traditional sales and marketing playbook that really haven't adjusted much over the past 10 years, but it's also a really big opportunity for those companies that truly understand who their ideal clients are, who the most important segments are, who the most important buyer personas are within those accounts, and what's going on in each of those personas worlds. What are they trying to get done professionally? What's sitting in their job description and their objectives and key results individually, as a team and as a company? And what are they really struggling with mightily when it comes to anything and everything related to data center design and construction? And when you know that for each of those 2 or 3 segments in their own words, not because you're guessing, but because you actually did your homework and you figured out their goals and their challenges in their own words, that gives you enormous, enormous power to get the relevancy right when it comes to educational content and when it comes to educational events. Say, for argument's sake, you're selling to the vice president of data center development for a contractor that's focused on industrial, that's focused on data center development. So, and you identify for that vice president of development, data center development, whatever the title is, that there's 5 or 6 big goals they're working on right now. There's 5 or 6 big challenges that they're struggling with. Those in aggregate are 5 or 10 topics that one by one your content and your events need to address. If you want them to be interested in you, be interested in them and show up in a way that teaches them valuable information that helps them do their job better. And when you understand your prioritized segments, your prioritized buyer personas, and you build your entire content marketing and event marketing strategy around that, great things can happen. Because the name of the game is we need to own a lot of surface area in the full buyer's journey. In a world where so much of the research and decision-making now happens without you in the room, it's incredibly important that we use your educational content, your educational events to get back into the room with them, to get invited to their side of the table. So you get out of the vendor box, get out of transaction mode, and have one or more super relevant stakeholders in these companies see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center design and data center construction. And make no mistake, if you bypass this advice and you pretend like it's still 10 years ago, your ideal clients and prospects are learning from someone. The question is, do you want them to be learning from your client-facing team members that stack the decks in your favor with building know, like, and trust, with educating and building trust with multiple people from these companies? Or do you want your future clients to be learning from your competition? At the end of the day, the choice is yours. All I can point out is that your buyers' preferences have changed dramatically, and the better job you can do with updating your playbook to match how they want to buy, so they see your client-facing team members more like teachers and consultants and subject matter experts and trusted advisors rather than just stereotypical sales professionals, the better off you're going to be. And the job of your marketer is to provide the infrastructure to make all of this happen. In general, in a self-driven buyer's journey, marketers will be going much deeper into the buyer's journey than they ever have gone previously in their career. And sales professionals need to be prepared to come in much earlier in the journey than they ever have in their career, so they can truly collaborate on positioning the entire client-facing team to be seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center design and construction for this particular geographic area, for companies of a certain specific size, in certain kinds of industries and specialized kinds of stakeholders. And when your content and when your events are that hyper-specific to who they are, the kind of company they work for, and most importantly, what they care most about, great things can happen. They're paying attention to you. They're showing up. They're learning from you. They're learning so much from you that they're highly motivated to bring their peers, their coworkers, their boss along with them. So you are teaching all of those folks throughout their awareness and the consideration stages of their journey, in those formative stages where the preferences around a lot of what they're going to do with data center design and construction are fluid and open to suggestions. And many times you'll find that when you do this exceptionally well, the short list, by the time they're ready for a sales conversation, is collapsed down to one company. Like, your company is the only one left on the short list. In other words, you've neutralized all of the competition by doing an exceptionally good job of using education, using content, using these kinds of resources and events to build strong know, like, and trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so that your prospects and clients see you as the experts on data center design and construction. So that is how a data center design and construction marketer can get an audience for their content and events. If you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you're facing in your own business that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. So what do we have up? What's our next question? How does a data center telecommunications provider motivate potential customers? How does a data center telecommunications provider motivate potential customers? So motivate's an interesting word, because typically when people are talking about motivating, they're talking about motivating their own team members, like motivating a sales team, motivating channel partners. When they're using the word motivating potential customers, motivating prospects, it's got to be with the idea that they're motivating them to take action, to feel comfortable moving forward with what you're proposing as a telecommunications carrier, a telecommunications provider for that particular prospect, for that particular customer. And in order for prospects, potential customers, to be motivated to take the next step, they have to trust your company. Trust is incredibly important. When we think about companies and how they brand themselves in today's data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities ecosystem, your brand is no longer just about your brand colors and your fonts and your logo. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about your company when you're not in the room. And given that we now have a self-driven buyer's journey where nearly all of the research and decision-making happens before sales contact, your educational content and your educational events are going to need to take the place of what used to happen in one-on-one conversations as recently as 10 years ago. A lot of companies in the digital infrastructure data center ecosystem have completely missed the memo on this. And as a result, they really haven't adjusted much at all. So there's a really big disconnect between how you're selling and how your prospects and clients are buying. Read that, it's super important. If you've been asleep at the wheel on these huge changes in buyer preferences over the last couple of years, you may not realize just how sales allergic your prospects and clients have become, especially when it comes to IT professionals. And the more experienced they are, the more veteran they are, the more years they've been doing this, the more cynical and jaded they are about anything and everything having to do with marketing and sales. It's even more difficult. And the younger the segment you're selling to, especially Gen Z and millennials that are increasingly in decision-making roles when it comes to data center telecommunications, again, you're really, really tying not just one, but both hands behind your back if you're selling the same way you've been selling like 10 years ago. 10 years ago, 56% of a typical journey was over before sales contact. CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, did that research and found that you were about halfway done before you got to meet a prospect. At the time, you may have thought that was challenging, but most people would love to get back to the point where they're still in there for roughly half of the journey. Unfortunately, that's very much in the rearview mirror. It's a point of nostalgia. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z, more millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people working from home at the start of the 2020s. And that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83% and shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon. In other words, Gartner found 83% of a typical journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens before vendor contact, before sales contact. That means that even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the last 17%. We got to get you back in there for the first 83%. And if you keep doing things the way you've always been doing them, by default, you're invisible in that first 83%. And that is a massive problem because your prospects and clients are learning from someone. But if you're not present, they're learning from someone who does not have your best interest at heart. In fact, they're likely learning from a direct competitor of yours, an indirect competitor of yours, or a non-business model competitor that's creating great educational resource and great educational events on topics that your potential customers care the most about. So in order to motivate your potential customers to feel comfortable moving forward with your company as one of their telecommunications carriers, one of their telecommunications providers, it's incredibly important that you get in early and get in often. And in order to get in early and often, being able to show up looking a lot less like a vendor and a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader is incredibly important. And telecommunications is really broad. It can be really difficult to do this at scale across dozens and dozens of different market segments. That's the reason why increasingly we're seeing so many companies that are starting to get very realistic about where they win best, what industries, what company sizes, what geographic regions, and they're specializing their marketing and sales teams to focus on just one particular segment at a time. So it's not uncommon to find among telecommunications providers that there's SMB teams that just sell to small and medium-sized business. Those are the ones, by the way, that are most vulnerable to being displaced by self-service, onboarding, self-service, sign up, potentially AI, because the unit economics are such that you're selling relatively low ticket sales, relatively commoditized categories, and there's not a lot of room left for sales compensation. So even in the cases where those are not self sign up that look more like e-commerce, they may be going 100% to channel partners. That's why the general guidance among people that have been in this space is that if you're in an SMB role, it's really high time that you considered figuring out a way to level up on your career to move into mid-market or enterprise accounts, where there's still a significant amount of complexity and figuring out what they truly need and the buying requirements and the competitive nature of that, where you're actually doing real consulting that can't yet be fully automated and done by the self-server or AI kinds of tools. And with that in mind, yeah, that's like a mid-market focused team where it's selling deals that could be, in some cases, it could be a few weeks. Usually they're a few months. The deal sizes are probably in the 5 or 6 figures. And then there's enterprise deals. These are huge deals where you may be working on these for several months or longer, and they're massive in deal size. They could be 7, 8, potentially even 9-figure deals. So your companies will throw massive amounts of resources at this. They'll put their most seasoned veteran people in them. So that's the segmentation by deal size or target client size. Then there's also a lot of telecommunications companies or just companies in digital infrastructure in general that are segmenting by industry. Deeply niched expertise in healthcare or financial services or manufacturing or telecommunications or state, local education, government. So those are the different approaches that companies are using to get deep expertise so that their client-facing team members are seen more as experts and not generalists. And those experts are the ones that are getting the leverage to get a foot in the door early and often, to get the inside track on what's really going on in these client accounts, because the potential customers, the prospects, see your team members more as peers and less like a transaction-focused vendor. So that alone, that hiring is not enough. You still need to be really clear on your ideal client profile. You still need to have a very focused target account list in most cases. And it's still incredibly important to identify and prioritize your buyer personas and understand what's going on in their own words, in their worlds. In other words, their biggest goals and challenges for your 2 or 3, 4 most important segments in these kinds of accounts, and really go all in on creating amazingly helpful, unique educational resources and educational events that help motivates those prospects to want to spend a significant amount of time with your client-facing team members throughout the full buyer's journey, getting in early and often. So there's that word again, motivate, is the motivating potential customers. It's not enough to try to motivate them to sign on for a telecommunications agreement with your company when they're at that 83% point. No, we need to be there as close to the beginning as possible, and as many of those 28 touch points as possible throughout the journey. And in order to do that, we need to be seen as an incredibly valuable source of learning and development as professional development. So again, specializing by their company size, where they're located, their particular industries, and their particular job functions, and being able to deliver incredibly valuable and hyper-specific, hyper-relevant educational resources and educational events is the name of the game on motivating potential customers to spend a lot of time with your client-facing team members and trust your client-facing team members, and ultimately move from being prospects to being customers and promoters and evangelists. And it's pretty much the same deal with your channel partners. It's just an even longer game, and there's even more at stake with motivating potential channel partners. So that's how a data center telecommunications provider can motivate potential customers throughout the full buyer's journey. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the love and hit the like button. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll tackle 3 more big sales and marketing challenges.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. And we're so thrilled to have you join us this week to learn about some of the questions and answers, some of the biggest challenges that companies are facing throughout the data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities ecosystem. Again, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you like to watch. So what is up next? Does an energy efficient data center solutions provider generate awareness? How does a data center solutions provider focused on energy efficiency generate awareness? That is a terrific question, and one that's incredibly timely, because in the world we live in now, where AI and high performance computing and supercomputing is on a, I don't want to say collision course, but is definitely competing for scarce power on a global basis, energy efficiency is more important than ever. And depending on the region of the world where you're located, you may be more focused on sustainability or grid availability, but it's both basically the same issue, as we need to use that energy as efficiently as possible. Costs will continue to escalate. Availability will continue to get increasingly scarce. So a company that's focused on providing unique energy efficient solutions to data centers is likely operating within the facilities part of the data center ecosystem. Energy and power are important segments within the 12 or 13 different kinds of data center facilities related companies that we track over at DCSMI. And these energy efficiency data center solutions are likely being sold to data center operators and end users with their own data center facilities. So when it comes to generating awareness, essentially what you're trying to figure out is what kinds of clients have been best served by what you do so far. Are they data center operators? Are they end users with their own data centers, enterprises with their own data centers, or both? And then within data center operators, what kinds of data center operators have you historically done best with? Do you do better with colocation operators? Do you do better with massive hyperscale facilities? Do you have unique energy efficiency expertise with edge data center providers? Again, only you can answer that question, but I would certainly think about which parts of the data center ecosystem that you have the best talent and resources and competitive advantage to win these deals with. And you'll likely see evidence of that when you look at the case study section of your website, or your testimonials, your reviews, your logos. And for sure, there's likely some clues about this sitting in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, as well as perhaps in your financial, your ERP, your enterprise resource planning system, when you have these kinds of conversations with one of your finance executives. So with all of that in mind, that'll help you get your ICP, your ideal client profile, dialed in to know where these clients are located, where you want to generate awareness with. In other words, can you sell your energy efficiency solutions globally? Or do you only sell in one region of the world? Or do you only sell in one country or in one part of one country? Again, we need to get really specific, because when it comes to how you approach go-to-market sales and marketing and product development, all of this needs to be grounded in the reality of where you can successfully market, sell, and service and deliver these energy efficient solutions. And depending on the nature of what you're doing, energy efficiency usually requires site visits. This isn't like you're selling cybersecurity. This isn't like you're selling infrastructure or cloud services. By the nature of energy efficiency, you're almost always going to need to have a physical presence that is either nearby because you have employees or channel partners in that regions, or you develop relationships with channel partners in that particular regions to be your feet on the ground to go and have close proximity to these facilities. There are some huge companies that have their employees just on the road 50, 75% of the year, 30, 40, 50 weeks out of the year. And I just spoke to someone on the podcast a couple of weeks ago who focuses on data center commissioning. And he doesn't travel to conferences, but wow, does he travel a lot for visiting client sites and going and doing these inspections of these huge chillers and things like that that need to go in these facilities. So there's a perfect example of, yes, it is possible as an energy efficiency consultancy or a solutions provider to have your team constantly be traveling. But there's a really good chance as well that at some point, depending on the sophistication level of your clients, they may demand that you actually have resources that live in that region so they can get there with a really quick turnaround time. So in terms of generating awareness, yeah, get specific on geographically where they're located, how big or small their companies are. When it comes to defining the headcount or the employee range of what's a good fit client for you, like at the lower end of the range, you'll know, right, what your minimum project size is, right? So like at some point, knowing your minimum project size, you should have a pretty good idea of how big that company needs to be to afford your minimums. So in other words, at the low end of the range, can a company have 50 employees and afford your minimums? Do they need to have 200 employees, 500 employees, at least 1,000 employees? I don't know. Only you can answer that. It has a lot to do with your pricing strategy, has a lot to do with the nature of what you actually provide, but that's certainly an important consideration. And at the extreme upper end of the range, when a client is so large, are there times when they have requirements that you just can't deliver today based on your current team and resources? So for argument's sake, if we're talking about an energy efficiency data center solutions provider, maybe your sweet spot is like 200 employees up to 5,000 employees, or 200 employees up to 10,000 employees, or something like that. That will certainly help a lot with dialing in your ideal client profile and building your target account list, and with everything that you're going to do going forward with outbound prospecting and ads when it comes to generating awareness. And then we also need to know, when we're generating awareness, we talked about so far at the account level. What about the individual people in these accounts? And again, it comes down to the nature of how big or small your company is, how big or small their company is, and what kinds of services you provide. But there could be energy managers, there could be ESG people, environmental social governance kind of people that you're working with on a regular basis. There could be utilities executives, there could be commissioning managers, could be finance, it could be facilities managers. There's a lot of different plays for the nature of who these buyer personas are that are most relevant to your company. But over time, you should see some pattern recognition and know, when you look at your last 10 big deals that you closed, your last 20 big deals that you closed, what do those companies have in common, and what stakeholders show up most often, pre-sales and post-sales in these decision-making roles. That will help you quite a bit on knowing who you're trying to generate awareness with. And once you know the who, we need to know why. Why do they want to pay attention to you in the first place? What's going on in their world that you can actually help them with? And that's your basic buyer persona research. That's understanding the biggest goals and the biggest challenges for your prioritized segments. What's going on in their world when it comes to goals and challenges that are directly or indirectly related to energy efficiency. And we don't want to guess. We need to actually do the research to understand what those words are, because those words are going to be the key to getting more relevant website copywriting, product marketing, sales enablement materials, email marketing, social media marketing, event marketing, everything that you're doing going forward to demonstrate to the most important people in these accounts that you have deep expertise when it comes to energy efficiency for data centers, whether regardless of whether they're a data center operator or they have a enterprise data center. It's incredibly important to generate awareness, as we need to know who they are at the company level, who they are individually, the personas, and then what's going on in their world that you could potentially teach them provide some valuable educational resources and some valuable educational events that gets the right people to pay attention to you at the right time and the right places, and most of all in the right context, so they see your client-facing team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with energy efficiency for a company like theirs in their particular location of roughly that size and a stakeholder in that particular role in that particular company. So when it comes to, if you have a huge brand, let's say you were talking about energy efficiency and you were in the very well-talented marketing armies of huge companies that do things related to energy efficiency, like Vertiv or Schneider or Eaton or Legrand or something like that, you don't need to necessarily be that hyper specific because you have a globally recognized brand. If your company is at the other extreme, where you have a few handfuls of employees, or maybe even less, maybe you're a solo consultant, or maybe you have a few dozen employees, building a brand is pretty important to stand out in a crowded marketplace. And one of the ways to do that is, instead of trying to boil the ocean at once, get hyper specific on who your ideal client is. Really, really dial that in. Really understand the company size, really understand the stakeholders, and go all in on really standing out to a very narrowly focused buyer persona as your primary buyer persona, and do the exact same thing for your secondary buyer persona, and potentially the exact same thing to a tertiary buyer persona, if there is a third most important kind of category of economic stakeholder that's incredibly important to the nature of what you do. But at the end of the day, we need to provide so much value to these folks that they're highly motivated to want to spend a ton of time with you, learning from your client-facing team members in a professional development and a learning and development context, early and often. It's not just enough to have one or two touch points anymore. We need to dominate those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. And our educational resources, our educational events that we're using to generate awareness need to be so over the top valuable that even when you get the first person to register or sign up, they're highly motivated to want to spread your resources, to spread your educational events to their colleagues on their team, on other teams within their company. So you get to meet the rest of the decision-making committee in their formative stages, when there's still a chance to shape how they view all of the options potentially in front of them when it comes to your category, when it comes to energy efficiency solutions, energy efficiency consulting. And the more you do that, the more you start to see multiple people from the same company all coming together under your umbrella and learning together. That's what keeps you on the short list. That's what starts to knock your competitors off the short list. And that's what gets you to the end of the journey, where you're literally finally going in and having that sales kind of meeting with them, and they're quoting your methodology that they learned from your company. You've had that much of a deep influence on how they navigate all of the choices that are in front of them. So that's how an energy efficiency data center solutions provider can generate awareness. If you have the advantage of your clients having extreme geographic proximity to where you're located, do a lot of offline events like breakfast seminars, lunch and learn, symposias, things like that. If your prospects and clients can travel to you within a 30 or 60-minute drive, or you're willing to do a road show or a tour to the highest density cities where you'd have clients. If you have a lot of long distance prospects and a lot of long distance clients, take a lot of the same approach, but instead of running these as breakfast seminars and lunch and learns, you run them as webinars and live streams. Very meta to how you're consuming this content, right? But it's the same basic idea, is that we know at the account level, at the company level, where they're coming from. We know who this particular buyer persona is, and one segment at a time, we do these incredibly relevant educational resources, incredibly relevant educational experiences. Like, in other words, If you determine that your 2 or 3 most important segments are an energy manager, VP of data center development, and an ESG officer, and you know each of these 3 segments cares about vastly different goals and challenges, you know, because you did the homework, don't be lazy and try to throw them all into one bucket or one event or one nurturing series or one lead generation campaign. Get hyper specific to who they are and what they care about, and tackle each of these segments one segment at a time. Certainly prioritize, start with your primary, the one that's going to have the most economic influence, but don't get lazy and don't try to throw all 3 of these categories into one campaign and one event strategy. There's so much to be gained by dividing and conquering, by segmenting and personalizing and customizing to who they are and what they care about, regardless of whether we're talking about in-person events, virtual events, or both. So that's my advice on how an energy efficient data center solutions provider can generate awareness. What do we have up next? Brings us back into technology and the data center operator segment. So this is, how does a cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity company generate new leads? How does a cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity company generate new leads? That is a fantastic question. And one of the challenges whenever we get a question like this, as you're mentioning 3 lines of business that could each be a separate company, right? There's companies that just provide cloud hosting, and there's companies that just specialize in infrastructure management, and there's companies that just provide connectivity. And you're saying that your company provides all 3. So to keep this example relatively simple, we're going to have to assume that your leadership team is doing a pretty good job of product road mapping and deciding to build products and services that are complementary to each other, that can be cross-sold very efficiently to the same kind of clients. If your company has been built by a series of acquisitions and there has not been great integration across the board, and there wasn't a lot of care and thought into how homogenous your client base is, you may actually need 3 different go-to-market strategies, 3 different marketing and sales teams to efficiently approach this. But if you've gotten the strategy right and you've built this out the right way, hopefully you're in a position where the same kind of clients are all prospects for cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity. So with that in mind, if we look at your website and we look at your logos and we look at your testimonials, your reviews, and your case studies, what do your happiest, most successful clients all have in common that have purchased and retained and been super happy with your cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity? What do these companies have in common? That's going to help you document that ideal client profile, which is incredibly important for your lead generation strategy. And your ideal client profile should tell us, where are these clients located? Are you selling globally? Are you selling regionally, nationally, locally? That's super important, because when it comes to figuring out your targeting, figuring out your target account list, figuring out your buyer personas, figuring out who you want to reach and what they care most about, what's top of mind, and even segmenting within those accounts, the geographic parameters for where you're trying to grow your business is incredibly important. So what's interesting is cloud hosting and infrastructure management is something that can be virtualized in nature, right? In other words, those can be sold long distance, those can be delivered long distance. Connectivity is generally physical, right? That's like telecommunications circuits coming into a particular facility. Carrier neutrality, IXs, meet me rooms, peering, all that stuff. So it's kind of like where your long distance playbook would potentially bump up against your local playbook of the reality of like having physical presence in that area. And historically, like companies that are in cloud and infrastructure management, they may have facilities in a small number of places, but they rent space in other data center operator facilities, like large amounts of colo space or wholesale space or something like that. And then they basically use that space to be able to extend their footprint into other geographic regions, both for disaster recovery, like DR kinds of reasons, or edge reasons, latency reasons, or governance reasons. So yeah, that's kind of where like the long distance playbook and the local playbook comes into play with generating new leads, or at least defining the geographic part of your ideal client profile. Company size is a big issue as well for all three of these lines of business, for cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity. Depending on how big or how small your company is, and how big or small your ideal clients are, you likely have at some point established some minimums on the minimum level of engagement, the minimum deal size, the minimum program that someone needs to sign on for with your company for it to be worthwhile and profitable to work with that particular client. Now, there certainly are exceptions to that. The hyperscalers, for example, offer public cloud space for pre-revenue startups that allow people to literally get started for almost nothing, and then scale up over time. We know the scaling up over time can be where it actually starts to get expensive. And I'm not going to get into a whole separate side issue of the repatriation movement and CFOs having angst and anxiety over the size of public cloud bills. But just to understand that there are for sure some hyperscalers that have very, very, very low cost entry points. Your company, if you're able to if you have self-ordering, self-sign-up, self-provisioning, maybe you can sell to tiny pre-revenue kind of startups that almost look a little bit more like B2C and e-commerce than B2B infrastructure as a service. Again, only you can answer that question. But for most companies that are providing kind of those blended services across cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity, you probably have an idea among your ideal clients of what size they need to be big enough to afford your minimums. Conversely, you may also tap out at a certain kind of enterprise client that may be so large that their integration, financial, legal, compliance, whatever, a host of proximity requirements may be prohibitive for what your company can actually do today. So maybe for argument's sake, your company decides for this particular ideal client profile, we're looking for companies primarily anywhere from 50 employees up to 5,000 employees or something like that. And of course, adjust for what's relevant for your particular context. And then there may be certain industries that are a better fit than others, depending on whether there's compliance requirements, especially on the cloud hosting side, that could either qualify you or disqualify you, depending on whether your company is able to meet those compliance, certification, accreditation requirements or not, depending on where they're located, as well as what industries they're in and the nature of the data that's being stored in your cloud hosting or that you're providing infrastructure management and connectivity services for. Probably more relevant to cloud hosting than the other two. But again, know your industries where you win and know your industries where you instantly get knocked out. That's going to allow you to build that target account list, which is kind of the backbone of being hyper specific about where you want to generate the leads. And then within those accounts, we need to know who are the people that we need to be educating and building trust with, that we need to be building these relationships with. So depending on how big or how small these companies are, in a relatively small, like SMB kind of context, it's very likely that the same person or the same team is responsible for procuring, for acquiring cloud hosting and infrastructure management services and connectivity. In larger and mid-sized companies and larger companies, this typically would be spread across multiple jobs, maybe even multiple teams that decide the nature of how they're going to buy cloud hosting, how they're going to buy infrastructure management, how they're going to buy connectivity. Again, the job titles, the functions, how granular your segmentation, your persona strategy is will vary tremendously depending on how big or how small your companies are, the companies are that you're targeting. But for this particular example, to keep it relatively simple, let's assume you're selling to small to mid-sized companies where the same team of people, maybe it's an IT team of 20 people, are all responsible for all three of these categories. So even if you don't get to the perfect person initially, it's an IT department of 20 people in a 500-person company. Everyone knows everyone. So it's not a huge deal if you get to a person that's indirectly involved, but they're not the decision maker, they're not the lead person in that particular initiative. For sure, they know who to introduce you to if they're willing and able and motivated to want to make that introduction. It's not like they're in an IT department with 5,000 people in a company with 100,000 employees in dozens of different locations. So in that context, you likely have a primary decision maker that's like an IT executive or an infrastructure manager or something like that. And you may also have like a channel partner, buyer persona, like a integrator or a consultant or managed service provider or master agent or something like that. So that's a really, really oversimplified persona segmentation strategy. You may need something considerably more sophisticated depending on how big or small your company is and how big or small your clients are. But that's just kind of a back of the napkin idea. So we have an IT executive and we have a channel partner executive. The IT executive and the channel partner executive have different things going on in their worlds, right? They each are going to have different kinds of professional goals that they're working on individually, as a team, and as a company. And they're going to have different things that they're struggling with. Those goals and those challenges, let's say for argument's sake, there's 5 or 6 of each of those. That's going to give you 10 or 12 topics that are top of mind for your IT executive that you want to be able to sell cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity to. Along the same lines, when you repeat the same research with your channel partners, with your MSPs, integrators, master agents, whatever you want to call them. And again, if you have a really big company, you may sub-segment, you may have sub-personas for relatively small marketing and sales enablement team. It's probably a pretty safe bet that your channel partner is a single persona, that you have them all together in one segment. They'll have different goals. They'll have different challenges. And it's really, really important to do your homework and to get those challenges and those goals verbalized in their own words, not what you think the words are, but what the words actually are. Because getting the words right is incredibly important for having relevant, hyper-focused website copywriting and product marketing materials and sales enablement and email marketing and social media marketing and your event strategy. The difference between you literally being able to like grab someone by the virtual shirt collar and pull them into the screen with hyper relevance and someone just completely ignoring you largely comes down to how much care you've put into understanding what's going on in their own worlds, what they're excited about, what they're focused on, what's driving them nuts, and how well you can demonstrate to them that you have potential answers, potential resources that can help them individually, that can help their team, that can help their company do better when it comes to finding the best cloud hosting, the best infrastructure management, the best connectivity resources. So that's the mindset to bring into what you do with generating new leads. Because the self-driven buyer's journey makes it so incredibly challenging for traditional sales and marketing teams to generate leads, it's so important that we figure out a way for you and your client-facing team members to get out of that vendor box, get out of transaction mode, and instead have your prospects and clients, have your channel partners see you and your client-facing team members as teachers, as consultants, as expert advisors, trusted advisors when it comes to anything and everything having to do with cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity. And I'm especially partial to doing this in a one-to-many fashion in an educational learning and development, professional development context. Because even though most of your prospects and clients are more sales allergic than they've ever been over the past couple of decades, meaning that they're doing so much research on their own before they get to you that they're almost ready to buy, or in many cases would prefer to buy without speaking to a human. We have to work extra hard to earn our way back in. Much, much more challenging, much more effort than we would have had to as recently as 10 years ago. And the best way to do this is educational events. It can be in-person educational events. It can be online, virtual, long distance educational events, but they need to be educational. Just simply having a booth at a conference, not the same thing. Speaking at a conference as a keynote or in a breakout session, yeah, you can be educating. The challenge with a lot of conferences is you need to make sure that their target demographics line up with your ideal client profile, that there's a lot of overlap, significant surface area. If it doesn't overlap, a lot of times you're spending time educating and building trust with the wrong people. So that needs to line up. It's incredibly important that the people that are attending these educational events see your client-facing team members as teachers, consultants, experts, trusted advisors when it comes to anything and everything having to do with cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity. And that's the reason why hosting your own events can be so much more impactful, because you control who gets invited, you control who registers, you control all of that. You control the time of the day, the time of the week, whether you get 90 minutes or 20 minutes, all of that, what goes on the slides, it's all within your control. Yeah, you're doing a lot more of the work, but it's so much more precise on your ideal clients and your specific buyer personas, and so much more focused on your particular business goals, and not having to compete for attention with 49 other speakers and 179 other vendor booths. All of this other stuff that's going on that detracts your potential prospects. So I'm especially partial to hosting your own educational events in your own facility, in your own conference room, in your own classroom, and your foyer. If you don't have that, finding space that's near your facility, that's affordable, where you can do this on a regular basis, that's in close proximity to your clients. You could potentially do a road show. If you identify pockets of clients across the country where you want to build the same general education and trust kind of events, but you don't have a physical location there, you could work with channel partners. And in addition to all of this, record these events. There's always going to be a lot of people that should have attended that weren't able to, the silent decision makers, the other stakeholders from the companies. And for people that where it's just not practical to do these events in person, run the same content virtually on webinars, on live streams. And again, the same issue. Best case scenario, a marketing kind of webinar gets about a 25 to 50% attendance rate. That's a lot of people that should have been there that weren't. So always record, encourage people to share these resources with other team members. You'd be amazed how much of an impact getting multiple people from the same company to learn together can have on advancing your deals, on educating and building trust, know, like, and trust, getting on shortlists, staying on shortlists, shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in front of them, and helping to scale exactly this kind of business when you know exactly what's going on with defining the ideal clients, when you know exactly who these ideal stakeholders are, these prioritized buyer personas are, and what's going on in their world, and how you can help them in a learning development and professional development context, so you can have as much surface area as possible throughout that full buyer's journey, throughout awareness and consideration, so you don't get relegated to just competing on price. So you get out of the commodity vendor box, and so that you're seen as true experts, the definitive go-to experts in your space when it comes to anything and everything having to do with cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity. So that's how a cloud hosting, infrastructure management, and connectivity company can generate new leads. Okay, we have time for one more question today. What do we got? If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button so other people can find out as well. Final question is, how does an oil and gas technology and services company grow its data center revenue? How does an oil and gas technology and services company grow its data center revenue? That is a terrific question, and it's incredibly timely because so many data center developers, so many data center operators are in this place now where their growth aspirations are meeting up with the harsh reality of either energy and sustainability requirements or just plain lack of grid availability. There's now multiple regions within the United States, for example, where you're going to be on a waiting list for multiple years to be able to get connected up to the grid. What do they call it? Behind the grid. They call it alternative energy. This is where you just start to see discussions about running hyperscale facilities, potentially on diesel generators, on liquid natural gas generators, turbines driven by turbines, hydrogen fuel cells, small modular reactors. There are some conversations about wind and solar and hydro, but most of those conversations are focused on running like lighting, interior lighting and parking lot lighting and things like that, certainly not powering highly dense racks of GPU-driven AI workloads in these data centers. You typically need more than just those kind of renewable resources. But yeah, there's a lot of conversations going on about energy, power, grid availability. So not surprising to find oil and gas being pulled into a lot of these conversations, both on what they can do with using the technology more efficient, with helping data center related clients use their technology to solve some of these problems, and potentially providing services on the implementation side and management side to help keep these grid alternatives up and both installed and up and running from a maintenance perspective, either on an interim basis until grid power is available, on a permanent basis as a primary power source or as a secondary power source. There's all kinds of scenarios being floated now globally on how to best address this. Battery storage is another big area that people are talking a lot about. So how does the oil and gas company that wants to grow its data center revenue, what should they be doing? Well, a lot of deciding where you're going to grow your revenue comes down to how. In other words, for a technology focused company, it's very common that you have a product management function, right? Like, so when you look at the couple dozen different kinds of technology and facilities related companies that are operating within data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, it is extraordinarily common to find that nearly all of these companies have product management teams, product managers, vice presidents of product management, in many cases, CPOs, chief product officers. A lot of these companies also have chief innovation officers, kind of the first cousin of the chief product officer. I've had the honor of having some of these folks on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast talking very specifically about these exact issues. So the product managers are figuring out where the company and the innovation officers are figuring out where the company are going to make these big bets and how they're going to make these big bets on bringing new products and services to the marketplace. Historically, I'm not sure if every oil and gas company would have had people in these roles that make them look like tech companies, but for sure, as they've embraced the opportunity to grow in and around data centers, most of them are waking up to the reality that they need to think a little bit more like a tech company and less like a traditional utilities company to be able to align with the stakeholders. So as long as they have figured out like what their product roadmap is, what their services are that they're going to provide, they should have a pretty good idea of who these ideal clients are, because presumably before they've invested millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions in building out these businesses, they've done their homework to figure out who these ideal clients are. And these are huge potential deals. So with that in mind, a oil and gas company that's selling tech and services to data center clients should have a pretty good idea of where these clients are located. In other words, you've got to be able to deliver oil and gas to that particular location. Can you do this by pipeline? Can you do this by railroad? Can you do this by boat? By shipping? How by truck? How are you actually going to deliver the oil and gas to these particular locations? So there's for sure geographic factors that come into play in the ideal client profile. Second, how big do these companies need to be to realistically afford your infrastructure to make this happen? Is it realistic that your company can sell to a single location or 2 or 3 location colocation operator with 50 employees? Or are you primarily selling to hyperscales providers and the next level below that, the big national colocation operators and or big enterprises with their own data centers? So again, you'll likely be thinking about like how much power, how many megawatts they have at a particular facility. You'll likely be thinking about square footage, square meters that define the size of the facilities and the density, and that at some point gets normalized to a number of employees that you use for prospecting purposes. In addition to that, there may be certain industries that are better fit than others, that are more likely to be receptive to what you're doing than others, but more than likely it's geographic and it's infrastructure investments that determine whether they're going to be reasonably interested in what you're doing. So that's like at the company level. From there, you should be able to build target companies lists of who you think is the best fit. And depending on the investment that someone needs to have with you, you may find that there's as few as a couple dozen potential clients that are in a geographic region that can be well served by where you have both infrastructure and shipping and delivery, railroad infrastructure, whatever it is to deliver your oil and gas technology and services. So from that ideal client profile, you should be able to build that target account list. And then within those target accounts, who's going to care most about this? Typically, selling to enterprise accounts, you'll have several different personas that each have their own spin on this. For the nature of what you're providing for data center clients, like the vice presidents of data center development, not business development, but actual development, super interested in this. Chief investment officers, super interested in this. investors in data centers, like venture capital, private equity firms that invest in data center developments, super interested. Real estate folks, super interested in this. The value of site selection and everything is many times driven by how are we going to power this facility? So there's a lot of different stakeholders potentially that you would be looking to build relationships with on a more tactical basis. Once a project is greenlighting, there's commissioning companies, there's facilities managers, there's energy managers, there's a host of different kinds of stakeholders that may be relevant to what you're doing. But in terms of figuring out how you're going to generate revenue, getting super crisp on that ideal client profile, the target account list, who the prioritized buyer personas are by the nature of what you are going to be delivering and how big or small your company is, how big or small their company is incredibly important. You may have community stakeholders that you need to build relationships with too. These could be elected officials. These could be utility companies that you're trying to integrate with. These could be regulators. This could be activists. They may potentially have a stay in what you're looking to do for certain locations. So it's really, really important to figure out who's going to care the most about what you're doing, why they should care, why they should pay attention to you in the first place. And it's very likely by the nature of your deal size and the urgency that once you figure out your playbook here, that you're going to want to segment out multiple teams going after multiple parts of this ecosystem. Like at the absolute minimum, you could potentially split up your go-to-market strategy to have a different team pursuing hyperscalers, data center operators, like big colocation providers, and a completely different team pursuing enterprises with their own data centers. You may also decide to segment out geographically, obviously, is a big one. But again, we tackle geographically already in defining the ideal client profile. So you're not wasting any resources in areas where you can't deliver these oil and gas technology and oil and gas services. So segmenting by the nature of whether they're an operator or an end user likely be one scenario. You may also decide to segment by industry. Maybe certain industries that are more conducive than others that are likely to be more receptive to what you're doing by the nature of their clients. There may also be certain regions that, regardless of your capabilities, that may be more open to what you're doing than others based on the current environment with elected officials or regulators in that particular region. So all of these come into play when deciding how you're going to build the go-to-market strategy for growing your data center revenue as an oil and gas technology and services company. If you're already pretty well established, you likely have a good idea of who your best clients are, and you're likely just trying to replicate those. If you're brand new, if you're a startup, you're likely hiring talent that's coming from some companies that's done some of this in the past. And the most likely playbook usually revolves around investing in where your newly recruited leadership team or who's in these roles has had the most success in the past that happens to align with your capabilities, both current and in the immediate near future. There's a lot of balancing acts, a lot of moving parts that come into play with all of this. But when it comes to being an oil and gas tech and services company that wants to grow its data center revenue, it's getting very specific about what you're providing, where you're going to be the most successful geographically, how big these companies need to be to afford your minimums, or how, at what point is an enterprise client or a huge operator so large that they may have requirements that you simply can't meet. And then within these accounts, who do you want to create the most awareness with? Who do you need to educate and build trust with? And then the rest is a fairly straightforward playbook. We need to do the persona research to understand for each of these 3 or 4 prioritized categories of stakeholders what they care most about, what's top of mind for each when it comes to oil and gas. What are their biggest goals? What are the biggest challenges that's directly or indirectly related to making an investment in oil and gas technology and oil and gas services? And just understand for each segment, for each category of stakeholder, they're going to look at the nature of what you do quite differently. Some cases a little differently, in some cases a lot differently. And the better job you can do of understanding that mindset and delivering fantastic educational resources and educational events, the more likely it is that you're going to earn your way in early and often. Early and often. Early and often is so incredibly important because we now live in a world where nearly all of these stakeholders are going to do a ton of research before they get to you. And the way that we start to win them over is by intercepting them as early as possible in their journey, understanding what's the topic, what's the goal, what's the challenge. That's a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for oil and gas tech and oil and gas services in the coming weeks or in the coming months. And the better job we do with intercepting them early and intercepting them often, the more likely it is that we have a significant role in shaping how they learn about oil and gas tech and services that's relevant for their data center, the criteria that they establish for comparing all of the different options that are potentially in front of them, the more likely it is that they start to invite multiple stakeholders from that same company, their peers, their coworkers, their bosses, other members of the decision committee that are incredibly important in winning them over. All of this starts with having extreme empathy for who they are, what they care about, and showing up over and over and over again in a way that demonstrates that your company has incredible levels of expertise in this particular segment of data center energy for this particular kind of company in this region, roughly the size and the specific stakeholder. And the better job you can do with exuding extreme value, extreme specificity, extreme relevance, the more likely it is that you're going to intercept that person early. And the more likely it is that you're going to motivate that person to share your educational resources and share your educational events with other members of that decision committee. Teams that learn together grow together. Most enterprise account executives at this stage of their career in this kind of environment have figured out that a lot of their success comes down to being exceptionally good at project management for their internal champion, helping their internal champion drive alignment across their own team and other relevant stakeholders, both internally and externally, that are incredibly important to getting a complex deal like this over the finish line. And you can do wonders to start to stack the decks in your favor if you're able to get to that person, those people, well before that 83% point. If you only meet people when they're already at that 83% point, someone else has influenced all of the awareness and the consideration, and you're only in there, best case scenario, for the final 17%. In many cases, you're massively treading water. I don't want you to tread water. I want you to be able to be in a really, really strong position with your sales processes, with educating and building trust. And in order to do that, we have to know who they are, what they care about, and we need to get in there early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so that they see your client-facing team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to oil and gas tech and oil and gas services for data centers. The better job you can do with that, the more beautiful things can happen. The more you ignore that, the more likely it is that you're going to be incredibly vulnerable to other competitors, direct competitors, indirect competitors, non-business model competitors who better understand buyer behavior and have better have adapted to the modern buyer's journey. So at the end of the day, know who they are, know what they care about, and figure out a way to insert yourself into their professional development and learning and development process, so they're highly motivated to want to spend time with you long before they realize that they need a vendor kind of conversation. When you do this right, you won't be the vendor. You'll be the energy partner. And that's what we're trying to do with all this. So that's my advice for how an oil and gas technology and services company can grow its data center revenue. So that is the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a challenge, a topic, or a question that you're currently dealing with in your company that you'd like to be considered for an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue. If you want to stay on the loop about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connect invitation. Make sure to mention that you are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. Just make sure to include that in the connection invitation message. And we're so happy that you're able to join us this week. We look forward to hearing your great success stories and how you're growing your influence your company's leads, opportunities, revenue, client base within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Look forward to seeing you back next week. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.